My dad's new girlfriend moved in, and he was trying to control everything, so I snapped back and told him about it in front of his friends. It all started when my dad introduced us to his new girlfriend, Karen. I was sitting in the living room, immersed in the latest video game, when he called me into the kitchen. Dad looked nervous, which was rare for him. Karen was standing next to him, smiling like she had just won the lottery. She was tall, with perfectly styled hair and a wardrobe that was very expensive. I remember thinking that she looked more like someone from a reality show than she did in our modest home. "Dylan, this is Karen," my dad said, his voice filled with excitement and uncertainty. "Karen, this is my son, Dylan." "Nice to meet you," I said, shaking hands. Karen squeezed it tightly and her smile grew wider, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy. "It's nice to meet you too, Dylan. Your dad has told me so much about you," she replied in a soft and pleasant voice. I nodded, not knowing what to say. My dad and I had been fine on our own since my mom died 5 years ago. We had our own routines, our own traditions, and our own way of doing things. The thought of someone new entering our lives seemed strange and unwelcome, but I knew better than to voice my concerns. Over the next few weeks, Karen became a constant presence in our home, and as she cooked dinner with my dad, joined us for movie nights, and even started suggesting changes to the decor. At first I tried to be accommodating. After all, my dad deserved to be happy, but it soon became clear that Karen was not just trying to fit in. She was trying to take over. She started rearranging the furniture, insisting that it would make the space more functional. One day I came home and saw that my favorite chair had been moved from the living room to the basement, as though it didn't fit the aesthetic, she explained with a smile. Then she started replacing our old family photos with new ones that included her. When I first saw her and Dad on the mantel where Mom's photo used to be, my heart sank. "Then, Dad, what happened to Mom's picture?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Karen answered before he could. And I thought it would be nice to show some new memories," she said in a casual tone, as if she had every right to make that decision. Dad looked at me with an apologetic but silent look. It was clear that he was trying to avoid conflict. Had always been more of a peacemaker than a fighter. I nodded, swallowing my disappointment. It was just a picture, I told myself, but deep down I knew it was more than that. Things quickly went uphill from there. Karen started to dictate how we spent our weekends, planning activities she liked without regard to our traditions. Gone were the lazy Saturdays watching football with my dad or spontaneous fishing trips. Instead, we went to art galleries and breakfast places that were more like Karen's world than ours. The last straw came when she asked me to move out. "You were old enough to have your own place, Dylan," she said over dinner one night. It would be good for you to get your independence." I stared at her, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. "This is my home," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen looked at her dad as if she expected him to back her up. Eddie avoided my gaze, focusing intently on his plate. "Karen is right, son," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time for you to think about getting your own place." I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. "And where am I supposed to go?" I asked, raising my voice despite my best efforts to remain calm. "We can help you find a place," Karen said quietly, as if she had already planned everything. I pushed my chair back, unable to sit there any longer. "I need to get some air," I muttered, leaving the table and going outside. I was standing in the backyard, and the cool night air didn't do much to calm my thoughts so quickly. Karen's control over home was getting stronger. From what we ate to how we spent our evenings, the more distant Dad seemed. The coming home later and later. I wondered if he was avoiding the tension at home or if he really didn't see what was going on. One evening I decided to invite my friends over. It was something we had done for years. It was a tradition that predated Karen's arrival. However, Karen had other plans. As soon as she heard about the barbecue, she insisted on organizing it herself. "I can make it more elaborate," she said. Her eyes lit up at the prospect. We'll have gourmet burgers, artisanal side dishes, and a specialty cocktail. I bit my tongue, not wanting to start another argument. But as the day of the barbecue approached, I grew increasingly anxious. This was supposed to be my event, my time with my friends. I didn't want it to turn into another one of Karen's carefully curated experiences. On the night of the barbecue, my friends came and found a scene straight out of a lifestyle magazine. Fairy lights were hung in the yard, a beautifully set table dominated the space, and Karen was fluttering around like a hostess at a high-end party. My friends exchanged glances, clearly unhappy with the change. When we sat down to lunch, Karen took control of the conversation, directing it to topics that interested her. My friends tried to engage, but it was obvious that they felt out of place. I could feel the frustration growing inside me, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Karen commented on how much better the yard was after she redecorated it, and I snapped. "You know what, Karen? This is not your house," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You've been here for months and you act like you own the place. You've rearranged everything, thrown away our traditions, and now you're trying to push me out of my own home. The yard is quiet." My friends stared at me in shock, and Karen's face turned pale. My dad, who hadn't said a word, looked like he wanted to sink into the ground. "It's not fair, Dylan," Karen said in a trembling voice. "I'm just trying to make things better." Who cares?" I shot back. "Because I don't feel better, and I don't think Dad does either. You're manipulating him, and he's too blind to see it." "Dylan, that's enough," Dad said, finally finding his voice, but it was too late. Words were out, and the damage was done. After my outburst, the barbecue quickly fell apart. My friends apologized and left, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. Karen went home, tears streaming down her face. Dad was standing in the yard looking torn between anger and disappointment. "Dylan, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight with emotion. I nodded, following him into the living room. We sat down, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. "Do you have any idea how much that hurt?" Dad asked, staring at the floor. "Dad, she's taking over our lives," I answered, and my frustration exploded again. "She's changing everything, and you're just letting her. She's trying to make a difference," he said, echoing Karen's words. "We've both been through a lot, and she brings a much-needed positivity to our lives." "At what cost?" I asked, raising my voice. "Is she pushing me out, Dad? She wants me to move out of my own home." Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe it's time, Dylan. You're an adult now. It might be good for you to have your own space." I looked at him, feeling a mixture of anger and betrayal. "This is my home too," I said quietly, "and I don't want to be pushed out just because she wants more control." Dad didn't answer, and the silence lingered. Finally, he stood up. "I need time to think," he said, heading for his bedroom. "We'll talk more tomorrow." I watched him go, my heart heavy with disappointment and sadness. I had hoped that confronting Karen would make things better, but instead it felt like everything was falling apart. The next few days were a blur of awkward silences and tense interactions. Karen avoided me, spending most of her time in the guest room she had taken over. Dad and I hardly spoke, and when we did, it was tense and awkward. I tried to reach out to him to explain how I felt, but every time I mentioned it, he shut me down. "I don't want to talk about this right now, Dylan." He spoke in a strained voice. "Let's give it some time." But time seemed to make things worse. Karen's presence loomed over everything, a constant reminder of the changes she had made in our lives. I felt like a stranger in my own home, tiptoeing around to avoid another confrontation. One evening I came home to find Karen packing her bags. She looked up as I entered the room, her eyes reading with tears. "What's going on?" I asked, my heart racing. "I'm leaving," she said quietly. I can't stay here and cause so much tension. It's clear you don't want me here." I felt a pang of guilt, but also a sense of relief. Maybe now everything can return to normal. "Where will you go?" I asked. Emma, I'm going to stay with a friend for a while," she answered in a trembling voice. "But I need you to know that I care about your dad. I wasn't trying to take over. I just wanted to help." I nodded, not knowing what to say. No, part of me wanted to believe her, but the other part of me was still angry at the way she had tried to change everything. After she left, the house seemed surprisingly empty. Dad came home later that night, and I knew something was wrong the moment he walked in the door. "Karen's gone," he said in a soundless voice. "I know," I answered. "She said she needed space." Dad nodded but didn't look at me. I need some space too, Dylan," he said quietly. "I think it would be best if you found your own place." I looked at him, my heart sank. "Dad, you don't mean that," I said in a shaky voice. "I do," he replied, finally meeting my eyes. "Annika, love you, son, but we need some time apart. Maybe then we can understand something." I felt a lump in my throat but nodded. "Okay," I said quietly. "I'll start looking for a place." As I headed to my room to start packing, I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. My home, my family, everything I knew was changing, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The rental market was competitive and there were few options available. I spent weeks searching, going from one disappointing viewing to another. Finally, I found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The move was bittersweet. As I packed my things, I couldn't help but think about all the memories I had left behind. Every room in the house had a piece of my childhood, a piece of my life with my mom and dad. It was hard to let go, but I knew I had to do it. My dad helped me move, but the tension between us was palpable. We exchanged a few words, and the silence was filled with unspoken emotions. When we were carrying the last box to my new apartment, he finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Dylan," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Me too, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my emotions in check, but maybe it was for the best. We both need space to figure things out. He nodded, looking around the small apartment. "I hope everything will be fine here." "I will be," I said, smiling forcibly. "It's not much, but it's a start." We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us. Finally, my father patted me on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself, son," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "You too, Dad," I replied, watching him leave. The door closed behind him, leaving me alone in the new place. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. This was my new reality, and I had to make the best of it. Adjusting to the changes in independent living was a big adjustment. Compared to the house I lived in with my dad, the apartment was empty and quiet. And I missed our daily routines, our conversations, and even our little arguments, but I also felt a sense of freedom. It was my space, and I could make it whatever I wanted. I threw myself into my work, trying to distract myself from loneliness. I took extra shifts, volunteered for projects, and spent long hours in the office. My colleagues noticed the changes, but I dismissed their concerns. Just busy, I would say, with a forced smile. Despite my efforts, the evenings were the hardest. Coming home to an empty apartment was a vivid reminder of all I had lost. I often sat on the small balcony, looking at the city lights, and wondered why everything had gone wrong. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I saw a post by one of my friends about a local community center. They were looking for volunteers to help with various programs, and I decided to give it a try. Maybe helping others would help me find some purpose again. Volunteering turned out to be a lifesaver. I met new people, made friends, and felt a sense of community. It was a welcome distraction from my own problems, and it gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Slowly but surely I felt like myself again, and up in a glimmer of hope, the months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. I still missed my dad and our old life, but I was finding my way. The House of Culture became my second home, and the people I met there were like a second family. One evening, when I was finishing my volunteer shift, I got a call from my dad. And I hadn't heard from him in weeks, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw his name on the screen. "Dad, hi," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hey, Dylan," he replied, sounding more tired than I remembered. I wondered if we could meet and talk. Of course, I said my heart was racing. When and where? "How about tomorrow in the park?" he suggested. "Around 5 o'clock. "Sounds good," I agreed, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The next day I arrived at the park early. My mind raced with thoughts of what my dad might say. I noticed him sitting on a bench by the lake, and when I approached, he looked up and smiled. "Hi, son," he said, getting up to hug me. "Hi, Dad," I replied, hugging him back. It was good to see him, to feel his familiar presence. We sat down on the bench. The silence between us was comfortable, but charged with unspoken emotions. "I'm sorry, Delan," Dad finally said, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm sorry for everything that happened." "For getting out of control," I nodded. My throat tightened with emotion. "I'm sorry too, Dad. I didn't mean to cause so much trouble. I just felt like I was losing everything." "I know," he said, his eyes filled with regret. "Then I should have listened to you more. I should have been more supportive." We sat for a while, talking about everything that had happened. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. We both knew it would take time to rebuild our relationship, but we were willing to try. Over the next few weeks, my dad and I tried to rebuild our relationship. We started meeting regularly, going for walks, drinking coffee, and gradually rebuilding our relationship. And it wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of tension, but we were both committed to making it work. Karen is back in her place, and although she and Dad still saw each other, it was slower. I could see that Dad was happier, and I was happy for him. I still had reservations about Karen, but I knew I had to give them a chance. One evening, my dad invited me to dinner. It was strange to be back in the house, but also good. When we sat down to dinner, I could see the effort my dad had made to make everything comfortable for me. "Karen will be here later," he said in a tentative voice. "I hope that's okay." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Oh, everything is fine, Dad. I want things to be better between us." When Karen arrived, she greeted me with a warm smile. "Delan, it's good to see you," she said in a sincere tone. "It's good to see you too, Karen," I replied, trying to keep it friendly. Throughout the evening we talked and laughed, and I could see that Karen was making an effort too. She was less controlling, more willing to listen, and I could tell that she genuinely cared about Dad. It was not easy to get rid of the resentment, but I knew I had to try. Over time, things slowly started to improve, and Dad and I continued to work on our relationship, and I made an effort to get to know Karen better. She wasn't perfect, but neither was I. We were all just trying to find our way. I still had my own place, and I was happy there. It was small, but it was mine, and it gave me the independence I needed. The community center remained a big part of my life, and the friends I made there became a support system I could rely on. Looking back, I realized that this whole experience taught me a lot about myself, my family, and forgiveness. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wanted to give up, but I was glad I didn't. In the end, it made me stronger and brought me closer to people I cared about. My dad and I still had our disagreements, but we learned to communicate better, listen to each other, and find common ground. Although Karen would always be a part of our lives, I knew that if we were honest and open with each other, we could make it work. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was ours, and that was enough.